I was surprised actually to note that it was being trialled in a Chinese league. This new offside rule, just because of what we're about to talk about, which is what's going on in Chinese football at the moment, which is some really drastic changes and problems within the club country's structure.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, again, it's always important to look at Chinese football and where it sort of stood, because it's had a really interesting presence in the global footballing community over the last decade. Obviously, China's never really been historically a massive footballing nation, but we've started to see these enormous sums of money, both in sort of transfer fees and wages, come in over the last decade. A lot of times to players you wouldn't always necessarily expect. But I remember seeing like Ezekiel Lavezzi was one of the most highest paid players in the world at one point. Oscar went over for a huge fee of 60 million at a time when, he was a good player for Chelsea. You might disagree, but he was by no means the headline attraction, and he was the one they snatched up. Hulk was another one who went over, who was always on the cusp of a big European move, but then got a mammoth deal to go over to China. And it's just interesting to look at some of these deals, because with the example of Oscar, for example, when he moved, he was reported to be earning up to £400,000 a week at Shanghai. To put this into context, he was earning £100,000 a week at Chelsea, which is, as anyone knows, widely considered to be one of the more wealthy clubs in world football. So this club that few outside of China were familiar with swooped in, took a Chelsea player and quadrupled his salary, which is just a bizarre sort of to come out of nowhere. You would think maybe if they could do it, they would give him a little bit of a bump, but quadrupling it. And then they also sort of partnered that by they got a lot of these household names over on the pitch. They also got a lot of big names in management to head over there. Obviously, we all remember, classic managers like Benitez and Scolari and Pellegrini, who got pulled away from the European rotation to try their hand there. But they also gave former players like Cannavaro and Giovanni Van Bronckhorst their first start in management. So it was a really interesting sort of thing that we saw developing, and China coming onto the scene. They'd not really dipped their toes into the football world in a massive way before, but now we may be seeing the dawn of a new football powerhouse in much the way that a lot of people look at America sometimes ago. Is this coming up? So this is where it's been for the last decade relative to the rest of the world. It's something that is brewing, potentially massive, but maybe not so much now.
Definitely not. And so for context, the reason why we're talking about this is because over the last year or so, there have been a number of problems that have surfaced. The examples of which I will give you. So in the last few weeks, the current champions of the Chinese Super League, Jiangsu Suning, announced that they were ceasing all operations of both their men's and women's football teams. So the current reigning champions are on the verge of being dissolved. They've been trying to sell the club for 6 months. No one has picked it up, and they're just going to cancel it. Similarly, this year, one of the Chinese representatives in the Asian Super League has been disqualified over unpaid debts. And there was one Chinese Super League team dissolved last year, and 2 more already, including the one I mentioned, in 2021, and we're only 3 months in. They still have a reputation for corruption. National players have not improved, and it's a real issue going on currently, and it seems like it's kind of across the whole country. So just to take it a little bit back and talk about, as we kind of mentioned, the decade of football that has preceded this. In 2014, the president of China kind of decided that football was going to be a national sport. And for anyone that's watched the Olympics, they will know that China takes national sports pretty seriously. So they set out 3 goals in 2014. They wanted to have 300 million kids playing football by 2020, which they have achieved. They wanted to be competing for best national team in East Asia by 2030. And they wanted to be a world superpower by 2050. And for all of these goals, a strong domestic top flight was considered to be crucial to achieving those aims. So what they did was they because politics is very interesting in China, and generally when the president Xi Jinping wants stuff to be done, it tends to get applied in the business world. So after making these kind of ambitious targets, a lot of businesses then went and invested into football. So it's been growing, as we talked about. A lot of household names have come over there, but it's been growing at, I'd say, disproportionate rates. It's interesting that you mentioned America, because I think that there's a lot of parallels there, for example, with high-profile players moving over towards the latter stages of their career. But these numbers, 4 times the month annual salary of players who are potentially, at the end of their careers is just unheard of. I mean, in America, at least, you can see that it's seen more of as an extension to their careers. They get another few years of earning good money. They get to maybe make not necessarily as much as what they would make in their heyday at their big European clubs, but it's still a significant sum, and America is an exciting place to live that a lot of players are being swayed. Not so in China, potentially because, China as a country from the international stage doesn't have quite that appeal as America would do in terms of going to live there, just because it's a little more cut off from the global community. But
culturally different languages to Europe. If you're coming over from a European country, you have a potentially good grasp on English, and you also have an understanding of European culture. So it's a lot more America adjacent than China is to Europe.
Yeah, definitely. And so, with this kind of move towards football, there's definitely been a sense, I think, from what I can tell in China, that the improvements haven't been quick enough, both nationally and domestically. So their national team, despite all of this investment, hasn't improved. And, their top flight has not become any sort of big player in world football. I definitely still have not seen a single Chinese league game, despite the fact that one of my favourite players probably ever, Hulk, as you mentioned, plays for one of their sides. I used to absolutely love him when he was at Porto. A little sad when he went to Zenit instead of moving to one of the bigger leagues in Europe. But I still followed his career a little bit, and I was disappointed when he went to China. I safe to say I have not watched any of his games since. And yeah, it feels like their get big quick scheme has failed because they've just completely overextended financially in trying to become relevant internationally too quickly. It's seen in no starker contrast with the fact that as of last season, as you kind of alluded to, 11 of the top 30 earners for all football players internationally, 11 of the top 30 are in China. But as a league, they make about as much revenue as the championship. So it's just not there in terms of investment to profit. I think the other stuff to mention is just that the Premier League's pulled the plug on streaming rights over unpaid debts, despite the fact that the deal that was made for 500 million was the Premier League's most lucrative overseas contract. They've also ended their La Liga broadcasting in 2020, as well as suspending FA Cup and Serie A this year already. So it feels like there's been a real move away from football, and the reason for that is because, as we can see with all of these big clubs that have won titles recently folding, success does not equal profits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is very, very key to highlight the difference, certainly between the MLS and the Chinese league in terms of sustainable growth, because the Chinese league growth has been very much a rise and fall. I would compare it most to some of the teams we saw in the Russian league have similar fortunes. Zenit certainly were very up and down. And I remember Anzhi Mashkala were the first team I thought of when I saw all these teams having to now slash their players. But again, the effect might ripple through to Europe, because we are now seeing a salary cap being put across the Chinese league, introduced by the Chinese FA. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about how the goal was for China to become a giant football superpower themselves. And you can see why improving the quality of your domestic league would lead to this. Certainly we've talked about, the talk about Jurgen Klopp saying that the English under-20s only did so well because there was so much international competition, but it does seem to have done nothing for the Chinese national team. And these new salary caps are meant to, prevent the import of massively expensive foreign players who will overshadow the development of Chinese players, and also reduce the number of foreign players allowed. The domestic players, incidentally, will be limited to a maximum salary of £11,000 a week, while foreign players will be capped at slightly higher at £52,000 a week to still allow some import of foreign players. But that already is a massive, massive change. Foreign players ultimately can only earn from this point forwards, from the following season, £52,000 a week. That is 8 times less than Oscar was earning. Clubs will also be banned from spending more than £69 million per year. Those that fail to meet the new rules will face points deductions, starting with 6 points and go up to 24, as well as having their players on high contracts banned from playing. So this doesn't mean the players who are already on high contracts, there is an amnesty period of 3 seasons to allow them to phase out. But it does mean that China is going to be a lot less lucrative for players to go to. For a long time, China was sort of this place where a lot of teams were looking at as a league to potentially flog their excess for a bit of a mint. And certainly several players were looking at it as a great way to earn big money. I remember Paulinho was over at Tottenham after having a really good tournament and then left Tottenham to join Guangzhou Evergrande, which everyone was sort of like, okay, that's one of those weird moves. He then played so well he got picked up by Barcelona, and then he left Barcelona to return to Guangzhou Evergrande, which... It's one thing to leave Tottenham, but to leave, like, Barcelona, I don't mean this as a slight to Tottenham, but more that, like, we've discussed so many times, Barcelona and Real Madrid, for most players, is kind of like the apex of their career. So, life in China was so good for some players, notably Paulinho, that he was like, nah, you know what? Barcelona was all right. And he did decently at Barcelona. He was like, Barcelona's all right. I quite liked it in Guangzhou.
Well, it's just these, like, you can't turn down being a multi-millionaire, you know? And so, as you say, it's going to massively change with these salary caps.
Well, so this is exactly the thing. So the fact that clubs are going to be slashed means that a lot of the players who are already there are going to start getting released. A lot of the players are out of contract at the end of the season, like Oscar, for example, like Paulinho, for example, are going to be out of contract. And if the club can convince them to sign a new contract at significantly less money, then hey, great for them. Good lawyers. I don't think that's going to be the case. So I do think we're going to see a lot of these players coming back to Europe. We might see a few of these players affecting the Premier League. It'll be interesting to see. But I just think it's an interesting precedent, looking at some of the stuff that's happening monetarily. The other thing that was happening with a lot of the clubs is that they'll have to drop their corporate sponsors from their names, which at the time of reporting was going to affect 15 of the 16 teams in the top flight, including, as you mentioned, Jiangsu Suning, who are the incumbent champions, are owned by Suning, so they would have just been Jiangsu FC, was the plan. Yeah. We do see a little bit of this in Europe. Obviously, you've got the Red Bull teams and you've got Bayer Leverkusen, but 15 of the 16 teams in the top flight were named after their corporate sponsors. Obviously, the reason for these new rules, as I said, are to encourage investment in the development of Chinese players, because the Chinese FA are displeased that despite all this money being put in and all this sort of football being whipped up, it's just not helped them out. And the Chinese FA president, Chen Zuyan, came out with a really unsettling statement where he said, no matter how big the club or how famous the player is, we will strictly follow the regulation with no considerations. Do not test our determination. Which, even reading, I was slightly chilled.
It's quite intimidating, isn't it? Especially, you know, when you consider the fact that it doesn't matter how big you are as a businessman or a business. If you know, don't follow the rules that China set out, then you will, you know, not continue in the way that you have. You will be forcibly stopped. You know, I mean, Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, who's like in the top 20 richest people in the world, has, recently just been completely cut out of business because of disagreements with politicians. So yeah, it's a serious threat. But it's a weird thing looking from the outside in, because definitely my instinct, and I know that I don't work in football properly. You know, I haven't been a part of clubs. I haven't been a part of, you know, things like the FA or FIFA or UEFA. But it just feels like, from the outside looking in, if you want to improve your domestic infrastructure, you've got to start with coaches. You have to get more top flight coaches. We saw it when you look at recent successes like Germany and Spain, and the amount of players that they have just across top European leagues compared to English players, is completely mirrored with how many top flight coaches they have domestically versus how many England do. And it just feels like, you know, in 2014, when England also, you know, made statements towards, you know, trying to improve their grassroots football, which has seen incredible rise in all of our youth teams. You know, we now have the most successful youth teams in the world by a quite significant margin. We did that by investing at grassroots level. I don't understand why China looked at the international stage and thought, we want to be like America and try and buy big name signings versus we want to be like Spain or Germany or England.
Yeah, and I think just the lack of understanding that you need a bit of a gradual approach to really have a sustained model. It kind of reminds me of someone like, if someone's never cooked before and they look at like the packaging that says, oh, put this chicken in the oven for 40 minutes at 200 degrees. And they're like, oh, if I put it in at 600 degrees, it'll be... No, you're just going to have a burnt chicken that's raw on the inside. And that's kind of what China have done to their league. They put all this money in and put loads and loads and loads of... Just some of the money that you've heard coming for some of these players who... are not the world's best players, but are commanding world's best salaries. And then the surprise that there's been no development, for their league in the 10 years that it's been happening. I thought the national team was going to go from being, I think they're 75th ranked in FIFA. They were going to improve that much in 10 years just from looking at Oscar play football.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And the weird part is though, so Alex Teixeira was an example in China that maybe signaled a heralding kind of a new time, because he signed from Shakhtar Donetsk, as everyone could well know because he played in the Champions League quite a lot. And he was a player that was not at the end of his career. He was very much in the middle of his career. He signed for 15 million euros. And when he did, it was the third time in 10 days that the transfer record had been broken, which is a wild stat in itself. But in addition to that, 50 million euros is not a lot of money. And what's weird is that it feels like they are the transfer fees proportionate to their wages is just vastly different to the whole of Europe.
Yeah, there were quite a few players that went over for more modest fees. Marko Arnautovic went over for about 20 million. Odion Ighalo went over for about 20 million, but then they were on these bumper contracts.
Graziano Pelle as well, I seem to remember.
Yeah, so it wasn't all the transfer fees. A lot of them did have large transfer fees, but a lot of it was just these enormous wages that, unsurprisingly, were either unsustainable or they're not. I also think, how are you going to foster personal growth amongst your squad, just on a management level, if some guys come in and they're earning 30 times what you, the local lad, is earning?
Yeah, it's super weird. I also find it really weird that they've got different salary caps for international players versus domestic players. That to me is just bizarre.
Yeah, again, it just seems like it's something really offensive. It's funny because there is a football player, some people might remember, Nico Yeneris, who used to play for Arsenal, and he has been living there and playing there for so long that he has naturalized himself as a Chinese person. He's got naturalized Chinese citizenship, which means that he no longer qualifies for the 52,000 salary cap.
Wow. Well, fair enough. There you go. It is, it's definitely an interesting time to be, I guess, kind of gently interested in Chinese football and what's going on. And it does feel like the bright spark that once was investment in football in China is beginning to dwindle. Attendance has peaked in 2016. Definitely feels like political interest has been lost a little bit. So, how will this shift affect not only football in China, but also football abroad in Europe?
Yeah, and I think for me, obviously the Chinese thing is very interesting in and of itself, but from a European perspective, what interests me most about it is the question now. You look at the MLS, it's got a salary cap, and now the Chinese Super League has got a salary cap. Do you think that that's something that we could ever see in Europe? Because typically, economically speaking, if America and China are doing something, the world soon follows. So are we ever going to see a salary cap in European football? And would that even work?
I'm going to take it a step back and just talk about, for me, the amount of money that's in football at the moment. And I've felt for a long time that it's been like a balloon that's slowly expanding, and at some point it surely has to burst. The reason I think that is because not only do clubs overextend, as we're seeing a little bit more of recently, and kind of go bust, but also just because the gap between, as you mentioned, the local lads and the people that actually go to the games and the players that actually perform for the teams they support is only getting wider and wider, and it's breeding a lot of unrest and discontent. And it definitely feels to me like a football is going to reach a breaking point whereby people will simply start refusing to pay for streaming services and will simply start refusing to pay to go to games. Just out of principle. I think people are going to start boycotting football at some point. So I don't think football will continue expanding in the way that it has, and the way that it has been almost exponential. So I think salary caps could be good, but I also wouldn't be surprised if kind of the market caps itself at what people are willing to pay.
I agree, and I think there's definitely evidence of people boycotting things in terms of payment that we saw with the pay-per-view, for example, that we saw earlier this season, or maybe late last season. I think it was late last season that we saw with the pay-per-view, and people instantly just went, nope, we're not having that. So I do think that there's some precedent for that there. it's more of a question of if there's a relation between the increased investment in certain teams and the increase in price. For example, Man City don't have anywhere near the most expensive season tickets in the UK, despite the fact that they're the most heavily invested in team.
But they're also a club that have gotten in quite a lot of trouble recently over their finances.
Sure, but not so much that it's going to stop them winning the league this season, probably, and winning a few more over the next few seasons, probably. I do think that the salary cap probably wouldn't work on a European level, just because UEFA trying to implement a salary cap across all these different EU countries would be difficult. Because the UK doesn't use the euro, so trying to have a cap that dealt with the exchange rate would be way too difficult. And also, I read an article talking about how the different tax rates would just make it really difficult to do. Like Monaco, for example, have no tax, so they can pay their players at a disproportionate rate because their actual walk-home earnings are much higher than someone earning the same amount nominally, but who has to pay 40% tax or more.
Yeah, and I think, there are definitely specific examples like Monaco where you would need specific rulings. And I think that, the French top flight needs to take a look at things like that to make sure that there aren't any anti-competition things such as that taking place. I would say, instead of Man City, I would look at someone like Bayern Munich, where you just see an incredibly solid club infrastructure that is just really well established. And they, to me, are the pinnacle of how a club should be run in modern times. I feel like, to be blunt, I feel like football's professionalizing. That might seem stupid based on, that might seem like a stupid thing to say based on how much money is already in football, but there are still so many decisions that get made that are not financial decisions. And, for example, pretty much any player, if they want a job at their old club, can very easily get it. I'm not saying that should stop, but I'm saying that, are ex-players always, at all times, the best coaches? Probably not. Mm-hmm. You're going to get professional coaches coming through. We're starting to see the first generation of professional managers coming through that didn't play for an old club. So I think that the world of football is going to continue to professionalize. And what that means to me is that it's going to get a lot more streamlined in terms of efficiency and in terms of budgeting. So, yes, I think, a lot of clubs have significant work needed, just in terms of their total club structure. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot changes in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and the reason I think it's interesting to talk about is because China have sort of done it. They've tried to speed run a football league. They've just done it all super quickly. And have they maybe sort of gone to the point that we haven't even reached yet? They've sort of put all this money in and it's exploded all over them and da-da-da-da-da. Is that like a canary in the mines for us here in Europe? And as you said, is football going to keep building and building till it bursts? Or is a sustained growth going to allow for it to either even out or just continue to grow and just be fine? It's definitely going to be interesting to see.
Definitely. I mean, I'm not sure... From my perspective, I'm not sure you can compare the two just because China is such a vastly different economy, society, and political environment. So a weird thing that I found out while researching is that, there's a really strong vocal minority of support for football in China. There's like a serious passion for football in that country. Not everywhere, but in pockets. And what's interesting is that apparently within these pockets, when the Chinese national team loses games, in 2018 they lost 1-0 to Syria in a World Cup qualifier, the Syrian team at the time not being able to train. So when they lose games internationally, the players aren't blamed, the manager is not blamed, politicians are blamed, and the president himself, Xi Jinping, is blamed. So it's just a completely different environment over there, because football's so tied to politics, which is not to say that football isn't tied to politics here, but it's just, it's a completely different landscape.
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one comparison for sure, that's absolutely right, but just in terms of, there are definitely some things that you can learn from football associations anywhere in the world, even though there's a different landscape.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Don't pay Oscar $400,000 a week and expect it to be a good investment.